culture of death that is targeting my children and my family? What happened to the Christendom that I knew and the robust family culture in America? The answer.
In his opening statement, my good friend Senator Whitehouse said, I want to quote, reproductive justice is economic justice, close quote. Do you agree with that?
I might, as an economist, use the word rights, but yeah, I do agree with that.
Okay. That's not true for the baby, is it?
Well, first of all, I would refer to a fetus.
Yeah, but that's, well, a fetus. I refer to it as a baby. That's not true as for the baby, is it? There's no economic justice for the baby because the baby's dead, right?
I wouldn't refer, I don't really know how to answer your question. I would refer to
was the baby
fetus.
Dead or alive?
We're referring to a fetus.
Okay, is the fetus dead or alive after an abortion?
The fetus would be dead after an abortion.
Okay, right? There's a baby at 21 weeks. Okay? The baby can feel pain, right?
Yes.
And the baby's pretty developed, right?
Yes.
And do you know the name of the procedure that the doctor would use to abort that baby at 21 weeks?
I'm not a doctor, but I believe it's a DNR.
It's called dilation and evacuation. And then the doctor would take what's called, the doctor would call it a Sofer clamp. It's really a pair of pliers with sharp teeth on the end. And without giving the baby any pain medication, and start tearing the baby apart. Is that right?
As far as I understand the procedure.
Yeah, and she might start with the legs and pull them out, and the arms and pull them out, right? And then she might go for the heart or the spine and just pull the baby out piece by piece.
Welcome to Understanding Our Times. I'm Ken Michael. Joining me is Pastor Josh Schwartz. 65 million child sacrifices have happened since Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973. And we need to ask some serious questions. Where are we at? How did we get here? Where are we going? And we're going to talk with our guest today. He's the CEO and founder of the White Rose Resistance. He just came out with a film called The 1916 Project. This is a must-see film for everyone. It can be seen on X. I'd like to welcome our guest today, Seth Gruber. Seth, we're so honored to have you with us today. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, brothers.
Seth, in that clip there, and in your documentary, a clip from it, you asked the question, how did we get here? And throughout the film, you point directly to a woman named Margaret Sanger. You talk about her history and her influence on Hitler and the rest. Can we talk about this relationship with Hitler and other eugenicists and how important it is for us to confront people like this?
At the risk of sounding reductionistic or overly simplistic, I did title my book The 1916 Project, referring to the year 1916 when Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, opened her very first clinic in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. That is, for all intents and purposes, brothers, the first Planned Parenthood clinic, which is now the best funded 501c3 in human history, the largest abortion provider in the world, the largest provider of the pornographic, obscene, comprehensive sexuality education in America's public schools, and now the second largest provider of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for America's gender-confused youth. That one organization can claim all four of those things, but I do contend that Margaret Sanger is probably the most successful leftist, secular moral revolutionary of the 20th century, whose fingerprints, if you will, on today's cultural insanity is greater than any other revolutionary that spawned out of the 20th century. And so naturally, there's always just these like mind-blowing connections, right, between all of the evil weirdos of the 20th century. So in the book and film, we really expose a lot of the cohesion and connectedness of all of these various movements of death that have always set themselves up against the knowledge of God. Why do we make the Hitler connection? Because the cultural consciousness in America uniquely goes to Hitler for all things evil. It is interesting when you actually look at the historically documented, provable links of the Hitlerian eugenicists in the Third Reich and American leftists. For example, at the Nuremberg trials, brothers, the Nazis, before they were hung, actually cited an American United States Supreme Court decision in their defense. It's called Buck versus Bell. We talk about it in the film. It was an 8-1 decision that allowed the state to forcibly sterilize Americans considered a threat to the gene pool, that white elite Americans decided you shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. Literally. Like, let me clarify what I mean by that. That means you're forcibly tying people down to a medical table and sterilizing them against their knowledge or against their wishes, okay? In the next 10 years, over 70,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized by state governments in America. Guess who endorsed Buck versus Bell when it was decided? Guess who celebrated and endorsed it? Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. She had a board member when she founded Planned Parenthood in 1921. His name was Lothrop Stoddard. He was the exalted cyclops of the Massachusetts KKK. He's the founding board member of Planned Parenthood, brothers. And one of his books was called The Menace of the Underman. Ooh, right, like who's the underman? Well, for him, it was Blacks, Slavs, Italians, Jews, and the mentally and physically disabled. And so they're a menace, right? Because they're preventing humanity from creating the Ubermenschen, right? The super race, or the superhuman, if you will. Well, that book was so beloved by some individuals like Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels and Adolf Hitler that Lothrop Stoddard, Sanger's financier, friend, advisor, and board member when she founded Planned Parenthood, was actually invited to the Third Reich by the Nazis. And Lothrop Stoddard is the only American on record to have had a one-on-one meeting with Adolf Hitler after he rose to power. It goes on, brothers. But the point is this: while Sanger may have had more of a scalpel approach to eugenics, and Hitler had more of a sledgehammer approach to eugenics, they were both operating off of the same worldview. They both drank from the same cesspool and were influenced by the same ideologies, and that ideology is called eugenics, and we can spend the next hour unpacking that. But these links and this history has been mostly hidden from the American people, and here's why. Because it indicts the entire liberal establishment today that walks in the same religious, philosophical, and political tradition of some of the most evilest men in the 20th century, and we prove all of those links in the book and the film, The 1960 Project. So that's the beginning of an answer.
Yeah, and wasn't one of Margaret Sanger's goals to depopulate the black culture? Because she targeted them when she came over here, isn't that correct?
That's right. You're pretty much right over the target. So the thing about eugenicists for your audience is that I would fear a eugenicist more than a racist. And here's why. A racist might boil down humanity and discrimination to melanin, skin color, or maybe one ethnicity, right? Or one racial class. But a racist might really hone in their discrimination into one narrow box of a certain ethnicity or a certain color of skin. A eugenicist has a very wide cast net of who they could potentially discriminate against, because a eugenicist is concerned with genes, right? Good genes and bad genes. For example, Margaret Sanger, people don't know this about the history of Planned Parenthood, she called for sterilization and segregation camps to be set up on American soil, brothers, to house all the undesirable. She called them the morons and the misfits. Like if you had a history of alcoholism, if you had a history of criminal behavior, if you were an epileptic, if you had a history of poverty and you weren't contributing to society, if you were mentally and physically disabled. These were all the different categories of the individuals that for Sanger represented a problem. These were the kind of people that had to be dealt with. She actually said she supported things, guys, like sterilizing poor minorities by putting a sterilizing agent in the waters of urban neighborhoods to sterilize the poor against their knowledge. And then a cure could be provided by the government if they decided to allow those poor people to reproduce and have children again. Margaret Sanger was a real demon. So that's why eugenics is far more sinister and dangerous than maybe just racism. But eugenicism always results in some form of racism. So for her, Margaret Sanger, she may have found a black person, guys, that was highly educated, well-to-do, well-connected, from a good family. Oh, and by the way, it agreed with her, that she would have loved. But by and large, her eugenicism did result in abject racism against American blacks. And so in 1939, the American Birth Control League, before it was renamed Planned Parenthood, her organization sponsored and launched the Negro Project. That's what she called it. It was an initiative of Planned Parenthood. And here was the opening proposal of the Negro Project. She said, you know, the mass of Negroes, particularly in the South, are still breeding carelessly and disastrously, with the result that the increase among Negroes, even more than among whites, is from that portion of the population least intelligent and least fit. By the way, you'll hear that word fit and unfit used by eugenicists all the time. They believe some people are fit and some people are unfit, and the unfit should not be allowed to have children. They should either be prevented from having children, or they should actually be sterilized, or if you go the whole Hitlerian route, they should actually be rounded up and killed.
I got a question. Thank you for laying all of that out. Beautifully, just connecting all the dots between Hitlerism and eugenicists and Margaret Sanger. So the question is this. Over the last 50 years, in the late 20th, early 21st century, Margaret Sanger is like the heroine of women's rights. How did that happen?
Margaret Sanger was one of the first open evangelists for the joys of the flesh. Basically, like, Margaret Sanger was trailblazing the path that the Woodstock sexual revolutionary feminists would later follow. 40 years later, you understand? She was blazing a trail of sexual liberation when that was still super taboo to talk about, like, have sex with a ton of people, who cares, right? If it feels good, do it, right? Like, marriage is oppressive, the Catholic Church and the Protestants are evil, like this outdated Christian morality, man. They're just trying to keep you under the thumb of the Christendom patriarchy. That was not popular to talk about in 1916, 1919, 1920. So she was like a radical sexual liberation theorist. Let's see, 1920, 30, 40, 50, 60, 40 or 45 years before the sexual revolution would take off as we know it. So she was, I guess, ahead of her time. But as brothers who know human history, church history, guys, of course, you recognize that progressivism is never progressive, it's regressive. Like, we're just going back to the Asherah poles and the Baal statues, because the Asherah poles was orgies and temple prostitutes. Free love, baby! But what happens when you live like that? Well, 9 months later, guys, you got a problem, right? Well, that's why we have Baal. So just pass the child through the fires of flame. Very ancient idea. Well, in her first magazine, guys, Margaret Sanger writes this. Ready for this? She says, our ultimate objective, here it is unlimited sexual gratification without the burden of those unwanted children. When you ask me, why was she lauded as the patron saint of feminism? Why was there a bust of her head at the Smithsonian? Why was the Margaret Sanger Award given to Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton? Why did Barack Obama speak at Planned Parenthood events? Why was Kamala Harris trying really hard to get the Margaret Sanger Award? Guess who coined the term birth control, guys? Margaret Sanger coined the term birth control. Now, contraception had been around for millennia, right? You can go back thousands of years. People were always doing preventative things to not get pregnant. That's always been around, but it was never, like, perfected, modernized, and culturally mainstreamed until Margaret Sanger. She coined the term birth control. Now, of course, she was a eugenicist, so she meant birth controlling. Like, she wanted to control what kind of people were birthed. Was a way to help poor black women plan their parenthood. Right, Margaret Sanger, big heart for those poor families. She just wanted to help them plan their parenthood. No. She emphasized the control aspect of birth control, if you know what I mean, because that's what every eugenicist is after. So she basically ushered in so much of the culture of death that we're experiencing today while it was still taboo. She was tearing down cultural standards that help keep society in check, those healthy guardrails, right? Like, laws are the wise restraints that make men free. No, we got to get rid of all the restraints to usher in a renaissance of paganism. In my
who sexualize children, and that to me, what we're doing to our children in this country today is an abomination, and it needs to be eradicated.
That all goes together too, by the way. The whole Kinsey sexualizing kids, like, Sanger's got her name all over that. Her medical director founded SIECUS, the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States, the first group to pioneer the radical pornographic sex ed in the schools. Her medical director launched SIECUS at the Kinsey Institute with a board member named Wardell Pomeroy, who was one of Kinsey's gay lovers. Like, it's always all gone together. And today, Planned Parenthood is the largest provider of that obscene sex ed in the schools.
Exactly. As we transition here, we just had an election, and Josh and I have been across the country, and Speaking of people, we were
Jezebel fell from her tower.
yeah, we just got back from Europe. People are excited. They're like, wow, we can't wait to see what this administration does. I want to have you take a look at a clip that we put together, and then we'll comment on it.
Our message to gay Americans tonight is this. You're free to marry who you want, if you want, without the government standing in your way. But that doesn't mean that boys get to compete with girls in girls' sports, or you do genital mutilation and chemical castration on our children.
What Vivek Ramaswamy is communicating, he's not saying this, but it's what he's communicating. It's what he's assumed. Assumed ideas are dangerous. That gay marriage is somehow neutral. But he says, what do you say? But leave the kids alone. Don't chemically castrate them and sexualize them, because that's not neutral. Yo, Vivek, it's all part of the same revolution. It's all part of the same movement. What do we mean by this? Because gay marriage is a misnomer. Asking someone if gay marriage is like asking someone if they support square circles. The historical definition of marriage means that anything that is not that is by definition not marriage. For all of human history in every society, marriage has been defined as the sexually